In this lesson, we're going to learn how to begin editing our ice particles and our ice nodes to get the effect we want. So here's where we left off, and I've opened up lesson_78_start. So here we have our ice tree, and I'm just going to simplify the interface a little bit. And we can do that, or we can hide the left and right panels by clicking on these two icons here. And now to move around in the ice tree is exactly the same as how we move around in the viewport. So if you're using the default settings, you can hold the S key, left click to pan, and right click is not rotation because of course this is a 2D interface. But we can hold S and middle click and drag to zoom in and out, or of course use our middle mouse key. Now if we select something, we can also hit the F key to frame in on that, or if we hit the A key, we can frame in on everything. So let's just take a quick look at this ice tree. And ice is an incredibly robust system, so we're not going to be able to touch on every aspect of ice. But what ice essentially allows us to do is it allows us to access the underlying data of our Softimage scene and modify it with these node connections. So the ice tree, or an ice tree, ends on the right-hand side with an ice tree node. And whatever is plugged into this ice tree node is what gets done. If a node is not plugged into the ice tree through any other node, then that node has no effect. Now, what happens is the ice tree sort of goes backwards and reads in the information that is connected to each node. So for a default particle simulation, we have a simulation root. From here, we have the emitter port. Now, these little circles here are called ports, and we connect the output of a node, or the output port, into the input port of other nodes. Now, not every single port can go into every single other port, and they're color-coded to let us know what can get plugged into what. So we see here these two gray ports are connected by this gray line. Well, over here on the left, we have a green port, which is essentially a naming port. Now, we have courses and lessons dedicated to a greater discussion of ice, so we'll just continue on with taking a look at this dynamic simulation. From the simulation root, we have a emitter from null, and this has, if we double click this, these are the properties we saw earlier, so this is how you can access all of those properties here inside of the ice tree. And plugged into this is simply our null emitter's name. Now below this we have something called a simulate particles, which is essentially what does the, if we have any forces, if we have gravity, if we change the size, it does that, and it does all the updating of our particles. So now let's begin modifying our emit from null node to give us a better result, or a result that's more close to what we're looking for. So to begin with, let's come down to direction and speed, and you can see we have this select emit direction, and right now it's using the y-axis. So if we select our emitter here and hit the V key to grab our move tool, we can see it is currently going up the y-axis. Now instead, we'd rather have it go out the x-axis. So let's go to our emit from null and just change this to use null x-axis. To see this, or to see if this works, I'm going to middle click. What we should see is our particles are now being emitted out the front of our hose. And of course, depending on your own scene, this is going to change depending on what emitter direction you want to use. Alright, so let's just rewind and hit play so we can see this in its full splendor. Now we are shooting out particles at all times, so we're going to need to fix that. And that is being controlled by the rate. So we can see here, if we want to reduce the number of particles that are created, we can lower the rate of particle creation. And to see this change, we'll again have to hit rewind and hit play. But now with this lower rate, you can see many less particles are being created. With a higher rate, many more particles are created. So by controlling the emission rate, we can control how many particles are inside of our scene. Now, Softimage Ice is an incredibly powerful system, so it can deal with a lot of particles. Now, it can't deal with Actually, it can deal with millions of particles, but it can't deal with something like billions. But if you need that, really, Softimage or any 3D application probably isn't going to be able to push that. For our case, we really only need a few hundred particles for this simulation. So let's now come in and let's actually animate this just as we can animate any other property to play correctly when it is plugged in. So when it is plugged into our ship here, we do not want it to be emitting any particles. So we want the rate to be 0. So let's turn our rate down to 0, and let's check which frame we want to turn these particles on. And I'm just going to left click and drag, and let's see here. Probably around frame 56 is the last frame where we want the rate to be 0. So let's set a key here. And then let's just move forward a few frames and let's set the rate up quite a bit, and let's click this again to set another key. So now if we rewind and we hit play, we can see our particle stream only begins when it is disconnected from the ship. Now I'm not sure if that's going to be the final rate we set on, but let's continue exploring this emitter. Now next we have these initial values, one of which we can control is the color. Now this is a very simple control. We can choose a color and the new particles are created with that color. Now to gain greater control over the particles, we're going to actually need to come in and add more nodes, because each of these nodes is tailored to do something very specific. The emitter node is simply setting up the initial properties of a particle, checking where it's being emitted from, and then letting it go. So the core concept of ICE is adding in new nodes and connecting them up to our ICE tree to create new effects and change the parameters and change our scene. So there's a few more things we need to set in our emitter, or that we can set here, that we can also of course change later on with other nodes. A few of them we have access to are the size. Now, if we increase the size and we rewind and hit play, we would expect that the particles would be larger. But as we can see here, they are not. And that is because of the particle type we are emitting, or the particle shape that we're emitting. So if we see down here, we're emitting a point, which is simply a 3D location. So by definition, points don't really have sizes. So to see the size, let's actually change this to something like a sphere. And a sphere is one of the most common particle types that I use because it works very well with all the particle renderers. And we can see now that we can control the size of these spheres that we're emitting by changing this size attribute. We can even do it while it's playing back. So this is a really great feature of ICE, is that it's completely integrated into Softimage, and it's integrated so seamlessly, any changes we make to the properties while it's playing will actually be reflected in the next simulation step. However, it's not going to be recorded into our simulation. So what we see here is only the response to us changing this while it's being simulated. If we hit rewind and hit play, we're going to see our particles are going to stay at whatever the attribute is set to on that frame. So exactly as we set the rate, or we animated the rate, we can animate any of these properties to change how our particles are created or interact with time. Now the one last thing I'd like to set is the speed, because this controls how fast the particles are being shot out of our emitter. And the speed of 5 is a little bit slow, especially for such a fast-moving gas. And we can see this if we look at this around frame, I think around frame 100 to 120 shows it best. As you can see here, the particles should be being emitted straight out, but because our emitter is moving so fast, they're actually just being emitted sort of in a straight line. So to counteract this, let's bump up the speed by quite a bit. Our slider only goes to 10, but like almost every property in Softimage, we can just type in a value, and if it's a legal value, it will accept it. So let's try something really high, or let's try a speed of 30. Now, depending on your scene size, the movement of your emitter, and many other factors, you're going to have to find different speeds for your particle simulations. But in this case, I found that a speed of 30 gives us a pretty nice flow. So we can see by increasing the speed, our particles are now moving much faster than they were before, and they're also spreading out much more nicely. And now at this point, we've essentially gotten to the end of our emitter node. Now there's a few things that I haven't touched yet, and some of these are more advanced features of the emitter, and some of them only come into play in certain areas. But to continue controlling these particles and to really get into the power of ice, we're going to need to start dropping in our own nodes and connecting them up to the ice tree. So let's begin that in the next lesson. So in this lesson, we took a look at how we can access the properties of our various ice nodes and how we can edit them, animate them, and overdrive them to create various effects here inside of Softimage. So remember, these properties are exactly like almost every other property in Softimage. We can come in, we can set them, we can animate them, and we can control them just like any other object here. However, they are being stored inside of this ice tree. And again, the ice tree is simply evaluated from left to right, and the only thing that is evaluated are the connections from each node into the ice tree. So in the next lesson, let's add in some nodes and continue to edit our particle dynamics.